Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1944. The house on 10th and Galveston didn't look like much. Just another squat, gray two-story home near downtown, unremarkable with cracked stucco and a weed-choked lawn. In a city that prided itself on appearances, it looked tired, closed off. The shades never opened, the mailbox never overflowed, but no one ever saw it emptied either. And if anyone knocked, the door stayed shut. The neighbors didn't talk about it much. They glanced at it from behind their curtains. Kids crossed the street to avoid walking past it. One woman swore she saw a face in the upstairs window, pale and frozen like a mannequin, watching her without blinking. She never looked again. It wasn't just the house that gave people chills. It was the woman inside. Her name was Carol Ann Smith, and in a city teeming with new money and old prejudice, she was an anomaly. A widow, she claimed. No children, no church ties, no visitors. She dressed conservatively, kept to herself, and paid her bills on time. She had no job, no visible income, and yet she always seemed able to cover her rent, buy groceries, afford luxuries. No one ever saw her with men. But she was never alone either. Two younger women lived with her, Virginia Evans and Willie Hudson. Neighbors rarely saw them. On the rare occasion someone caught a glimpse, the girls looked off, pale, thin, not quite present. They didn't speak. They didn't smile. They moved like shadows behind Carol's heels. People whispered about witchcraft, about blackmail, about sign. No one knew the half of it. In October of 1944, the Tulsa Police Department received a quiet tip. An anonymous call. Something about two women being held in a basement. The dispatcher almost ignored it. These things rarely amounted to anything. But something in the caller's voice, hushed, strained, made him write it down. And the next day, two officers knocked on Carol Ann Smith's door. She answered like a lady. Calm, polite, her hair pinned, her dress pressed. When asked if they could take a look around, she smiled faintly and stepped aside. The house was cold, curtains drawn, lamps off. The floor creaked under their feet. Everything looked arranged, clean, but lifeless. Too quiet. They asked if anyone else was home. Carol said no. But then they heard it, a faint creak from below, a whisper, movement. The basement door was locked. When they pried it open, they expected resistance. But the scene that unfolded was something different. Two women stood in the half-light, thin, silent, expressionless. Their clothes were worn, their hands folded, their eyes empty. They didn't scream, didn't run, they didn't even flinch. The basement had no bed, just cots on concrete. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. No bathroom, no kitchen, no windows. In one corner sat a plate with old crumbs, and in another, a pail half filled with water. They had been living like this for years. Virginia Evans had once worked as a school teacher. She came from a modest family, but was known for her independence. Willie Hudson was the daughter of a well-off farming family, quiet but ambitious. They had their own lives until they met Carol. The details came out slowly. At first, the women insisted they were fine, that Carol had taken them in during a hard time, that they chose to stay. But as police dug deeper, the truth unfolded like a nightmare. Carol had met them at different times, both struggling with loneliness, grief, or financial hardship. She offered comfort, guidance, a room. She called herself a spiritual advisor, told them the world outside was poisoned, that evil forces were waiting to consume them. But she could protect them. She could teach them how to cleanse themselves, how to be saved. Over time, she chipped away at their identities, took their money, had them sign over assets. One by one, their connections to the outside world disappeared. She dictated what they ate, when they slept, what they wore, even when they spoke. They weren't allowed to read, to pray without her, or to look in mirrors. Carol told them they were marked, that their past lives had cursed them, and only she could contain the darkness within them. She convinced them that sunlight would burn them, that laughter drew evil spirits, that anyone who touched them without permission would steal their souls. Eventually, they stopped asking questions. They moved to the basement, and they stayed there. The newspapers couldn't get enough. "Hex House discovered in Tulsa," the headlines screamed. Reporters pored over every detail, branding Carol as a witch, a psychic, a cult leader. They interviewed neighbors, churchgoers, former landlords. Stories poured in. Rumors of seances, of strange chanting in the dead of night, of packages delivered with no return address. Someone even claimed to have seen a pentagram drawn in chalk on the back porch. But the real horror wasn't in the occult. It was in the cold logic of what Carol had done. She hadn't used violence. She didn't tie them up. She had simply stolen their will. In court, prosecutors charged her not with kidnapping, but with fraud, coercion, and grand larceny. She had drained their accounts, forced them into labor, and isolated them to the point of dependency. Carol never raised her voice, never struck a blow. She didn't have to. One psychiatrist testified that the women showed signs of extreme psychological subjugation, that their sense of self had been systematically dismantled. They had no opinions of their own, no memories they trusted. They responded only to Carol's voice. When asked why they hadn't tried to leave, Virginia simply said, "We couldn't." Carol, for her part, was unbothered. She denied nothing, claimed everything she did was out of love, that she had saved them from worse fates, that she had taught them to live in purity. Her defense argued that no crimes had been committed. The women were adults. They had consented. They had stayed of their own volition. The judge didn't see it that way. Carol was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a $1,000 fine. That was all. A year for years of psychological torment. A fine for 2 lives unraveled. She served less than 12 months. When Carol got out, she vanished. Some say she moved to Missouri under a different name. Others think she fled the country. There were rumors, always rumors. A woman matching her description seen in Kansas, working in a shop. Another spotted in Denver, running a boarding house, but none were ever confirmed. Virginia and Willie tried to move on. Virginia was admitted to a psychiatric facility for treatment, later released to live with family. Willie disappeared from public record entirely. Neither woman ever gave a full interview again. The house on Galveston stood for decades, empty, rotting. People said it was cursed. Teenagers broke in on dares. One claimed to see writing on the basement wall, "Obey and be saved." Another swore he heard crying from under the floor. The city tried to sell the lot several times. No buyers. It was finally demolished in the 1970s. Nothing has stood there since. The Hex House was not a house of ghosts. It had no bloody murders, no spectral sightings. It was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by what people are capable of doing to each other, quietly, methodically, under the guise of care. It was haunted by the truth that evil doesn't always come with screams. Sometimes it whispers, smiles, offers you safety, and then it closes the door behind you. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.